right, I see all the media is entering the room. If media folks can do me a favor and use the raise hand icon, if you would like to record, and that will allow me to quickly get to you and turn recording on for you. Thank you. Okay. Everyone's in the waiting room. Everyone's been allowed to record. Mayor, you can take it away whenever you're ready.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Today, you're going to hear from elected officials, community leaders, as well as law enforcement professionals. We're here together today to tell you that we are unified in our fight against the ongoing harm being done to neighborhoods and people all across the city of Portland. We want you to know that we collectively condemn hateful, intimidating, and destructive acts. And we want you to know that we're aligning our resources, we're revising our tactics, and we're fighting back with everything that we've got. That was certainly the case on Friday evening. We agree that that was not your everyday peaceful, passionate Portland protest. You're going to hear from law enforcement about how there were clearly bad actors amongst the crowd. You're also going to hear today from African-American leaders who do not believe that criminal destruction or violence supports the Black Lives Matter movement. And you're going to hear that the Portland police successfully and peacefully controlled the situation on Friday. They brought it to a peaceful conclusion. We're also going to explain how we're working with different levels of government, the district attorney, the sheriff, our federal partners, and many others in the community to strike a balance between peaceful protest and safety on one hand and holding bad actors accountable who are engaged in acts of criminal destruction and violence. First up this afternoon, you're going to hear from Sheriff Mike Reese, then Assistant Police Chief Chris Davis, followed by the Acting United States Attorney Scott Ospog. Then you're going to hear from former State Senator Margaret Carter, former State Senator Avell Gordley, and former Trailblazer Terry Porter. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sheriff Mike Reese.
Mayor, thank you very much. And I want to start by saying that I believe that public safety is the foundation for a healthy and thriving community. Senseless acts of violence and property destruction detract from the livability of our neighborhoods, and it puts everyone's safety at risk. As a Multnomah County Sheriff, I support calls by Mayor Wheeler and the many leaders that are here today. The violence must end. Recent riotous activity and destruction of property by self-described anarchists do not support the calls for social justice and system reform. They only simply damage private property from businesses already suffering from the economic slowdown due to COVID-19, and they disrupt vital public safety and government services that our community relies on. Responding to these events pulls away resources from public safety priorities. At MCSO, we're committed to collaborating with our criminal justice system partners to hold these individuals accountable who engage in illegal behavior. We continue to support the Portland Police Bureau and other law enforcement partners in responding to these acts of violence. I'm committed to the safety and well-being of our entire community. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff Reese. Next up is Assistant Police Chief Chris Davis.
Good afternoon. I'm Deputy Chief Chris Davis of the Portland Police Bureau. On March 12th, there was an event in the Pearl District which was advertised as a so-called direct action event. And at such events in the past, we have experienced significant criminal activity, including vandalism, intimidation of community members, and assaults against police officers and deputy sheriffs. There was a group that we encountered on the 12th that's the same group that we have seen at destructive events over the past 9 months, including one as recently as February 27th in the same neighborhood in the Pearl District, where significant damage was done to local businesses. This group gathered together and it moved together in a cohesive manner, and it had a few support vehicles behind it. And then there were people at the back of the group who at various points were taking outdoor furniture from businesses and other items to put them in the road to block traffic. These are criminal offenses, disorderly conduct and theft in that case. The group stopped in a couple of locations and gathered around, and at those times windows were broken. And so at this point, we had every indication that what we were experiencing was the same destructive criminal behavior as in past such events. So our incident command team made the decision to detain the entire group based on reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. This included and was not limited to blocking streets, which is disorderly conduct, and damaging property, which is the crime of criminal mischief in the state of Oregon. As soon as the group was detained, legal observers and credentialed journalists were allowed to leave with no further involvement with the police. And then from there, we identified and photographed each member of the group, starting with people with disabilities or other special needs that gave them a need to leave as quickly as we could get them out of the area. In total, we arrested 13 people who refused to leave the area after we reopened the street and were blocking traffic. We also recovered a number of weapons, including firearms, which members of the group discarded when they were detained. Some members of the group returned after they were released and tried to interfere with the officers, and a few arrests were made related to this, including one person who threw a full can of beer at a police officer. The mass detention was a lawful action based on the group's continued involvement in criminal activity over a long period of time, its cohesive actions in support of people committing acts of vandalism, and the criminal activity occurring in the group. A few minutes before they were detained, members of this group broke 4 to 6 windows near 15th and Northwest Overton. And we decided at that point not to wait until there was more widespread destruction to take the appropriate action. I want to be clear that this was not a protest group. This was a group of people who have come to believe that they're entitled to damage other people's property, threaten community members, and assault our police officers. And our intent is to hold them accountable. Information gathered from people who were detained is part of the ongoing criminal investigation into activity that has gone on at this and other events. On Saturday, we had 4 peaceful protest events in the city, and none of these events involved criminal activity, and thus no one was arrested or detained at any of them. This group from the Pearl District, however, on Saturday returned to the federal courthouse and broke more windows. Criminal activity in the name of political extremism is still criminal activity, and we will not tolerate criminal activity. And this behavior is not consistent with Portland's values, and I know community members are concerned about this continued destruction and violence in our neighborhoods. I want you to know that we hear you and that we'll do everything we can within the law and our resources to end this and to hold those responsible for these acts accountable. We're committed to doing this the right way. We will follow the law and we will respect the rights of all to be safe in their community and to exercise their constitutional rights to freedom of speech and assembly. I want to thank all the community members who've reached out since Friday in support of our efforts, and we welcome your input in the future in our work on this important matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Police Chief Chris Davis. Next up is Acting U.S. Attorney Scott Ospog.
Good afternoon. My name is Scott Ospog, and I'm the Acting U.S. Attorney for Oregon. I work in the building that's become ground zero for what's been inaccurately described as protest-related violence. That description is false and plays into the hands of the few agitators whose criminal actions work to hijack the goals of social and racial injustice, or social and racial justice, that the workforce inside my building work each day to support. The Mark Hatfield United States Courthouse is named after an icon of civil rights, social justice, and racial equality in America. He was a man deeply committed to peace and was an opponent of the Vietnam War. He supported peaceful protest and was a tireless advocate of Indigenous persons. The Hatfield Courthouse is well named because the people who work here, the custodians, the prosecutors and defense attorneys, the U.S. Marshals, the probation officers, court reporters, and judges, are all dedicated public servants who come to work each day with the same goal: to do the right thing on behalf of the community. This is where Oregonians come to litigate civil rights, where issues of public safety, the environment, and the rights of tribal nations are heard before judges. This building represents justice to all Oregonians. Let me be crystal clear. The people who work here support the voices of racial and social justice, but we will not be intimidated from doing our jobs by ugly graffiti or by broken windows. We do not confuse the voices of the many with the shouts of the few who hope to hold our city hostage by petty crime and violence. Hardening the exterior of the federal courthouse was the easy part, but this is not a federal issue. This is not a state or a local issue. This is a community-wide issue around which we all need to come together to stop. Each one of these rioters is a son, daughter, brother, sister, friend, or life partner of someone who knows that what they are doing is wrong, is hurting our city, and will end badly for their loved one. We need you to raise your voice too. Tell them to stop. Tell them that their continued violence is only hurting their cause, and tell them they will be held accountable for their crimes. Especially in this time of optimism about the end of the pandemic, it's time for us all to come together. Come together to reckon with social and racial injustice, come together to bring our city back to life, and come together to stop the few who hope to keep our community torn apart. Those of us who work in the Hatfield Courthouse are ready to do our part. Are you? Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Next up is former State Senator Margaret Carter. Good afternoon, Senator. Senator, you're muted still. There you go.
Okay, thank you so much, Mayor. And I'm very pleased to see you call the community together at large. And my comments are directly to those who are responsible for what is going on in our city. Yes, words matter, folk, but I want you to know Black lives matter. But most importantly, your actions matter. And I'm asking you as protesters and marchers to hear the words of those who have come before you on this journey of marching and protesting for justice. We never destroyed property. It was always a peaceful march. There are always a few bad eggs that come in, but for the most part, those that are there for justice and for creating opportunity for all people in our community, we must be as accountable as those who are unaccountable for their action. So this journey of marching and protesting for justice is something that Senator Gordon and I have marched with the same concerns. It is definitely your constitutional right to march and protest when you think our government is not listening, but it is certainly not your right to create violence and destruction upon merchants and our once beautiful city. Please stop it today. Our city commissioners and the mayors have voiced their sentiments of support for you to march and express your desires for change. But as all of us know, change is never immediate. And for every marcher that marches for freedom, there are marchers on the other side that are against those same freedoms. So our leaders have to balance both of the concerns of those on the right side as well as those on the bad side. So I stand with you today in seeking change in the interactions that goes on in our government that you have problems with. But I don't stand with you in seeing our city being torn apart as it is. So appropriate accountability on the part of our government is necessary, but appropriate accountability on your part is necessary. Policies and laws must be put in place and acted upon with equal protections when unarmed citizens are involved in marching. But when you are marching and you're creating violence, you have to stand accountable. I don't in any way support violence, intimidation, nor the kind of damage done to our once beautiful downtown Portland. I ask you to cease and desist immediately from your violent acts of destruction in our great city. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Next up is former State Senator Avel Gordley. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Let me say, first of all, that I support Mayor Wheeler and Chief Lavelle and all that they are doing tirelessly to rescue our city from lawlessness. And I recognize, as we all should, that they cannot do this work alone. They need all of us to help. I support the call of the Interfaith Peace and Action Collaborative for investments in violence prevention and demand that the entire City Council support the call from this Peace Collaborative for these investments. We must do all that we can to stop the gunplay on our streets and in our homes. And I want to say that, speaking as an elder and lifelong Portlander of 74 years, all the violence, the gunplay, the anarchist behavior, and lawlessness in our streets is disturbing everyone's peace and has some of us feeling that we're living in fear of the anarchists and when they're going to strike next, when and where the gunplay is going to hit, when and where the bullets are going to fly. The misguided and miseducated anarchists reject civility and instead intentionally create mayhem through criminally destructive behavior, tearing up our city, and this must stop. Some engaged in this criminal behavior say they're doing it to support Black Lives Matter. No, we reject that. They need to stop. And I say to them today, stop. You are not helping. You are not helping. You are hurting Black people. We need peacemakers and peacekeepers. We need peacemakers and peacekeepers. And to those who are concerned about police accountability, please know that I share some of those concerns and at the same time support community policing. I remember the 1980s and our community policing worked together to rescue parts of Northeast Portland. And I invite the citizens of our city to read a thoughtful column in this past Sunday's Oregonian by Candace Avalos, where she presents a vision for what community policing could look like. And I will say that in all of my years of living in Portland, many of those years spent working for fairness in the administration of justice, I remain hopeful. This is our city. Let's claim it. Let's put our arms around it, and let's all do better because we can.
Thank you, Senator. We appreciate it. And next up is somebody who really needs no introduction, former trailblazer Terry Porter. Good afternoon.
Oh, yes, Mayor, good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? I hope everybody can hear me.
Yeah, loud and clear. You sound great.
Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate it. Appreciate all your work. The violence happening in our streets is very disturbing. I'm speaking out today as someone who loves Portlanders and someone who is deeply concerned about the future of our city. As a father, as someone who has coached hundreds of young people, and a mentor to many who I've saw grow up at the Boys and Girls Clubs. Portlanders have always believed in me, and I've always believed in Portland. And on behalf of myself, my family, I appreciate those standing up peacefully for Black lives, but those that continue to cause destruction and vandalize the small businesses in our city, our great city, our beautiful city, I have a message. This is not what Black Lives Movement is about. It does not make me as a Black man any safer. This is a distraction from the important work that needs to be done. And as I'm learning more and more about the issues, we must address those issues. The gun violence plaguing our streets. We've had a record 200 shootings since the beginning of the year. We must address the 20% of children in Multnomah County that are living in poverty, with the majority of these young people coming from communities of color. We must address the graduation rates of Black students. We're coming out of a pandemic, and economic recovery will take all of us working together. We won't be able to address the issues impacting Black lives if we don't stand together peacefully. I urge us to turn a new chapter together, one of dialogue and building common ground, and not one based on fear and intimidation. I know what it feels like when Portlanders stand together. We all do. We've seen it. Let's walk together as one Portland to show the country how we can stand for humanity and where all of us strive, our businesses, our artists, our neighbors, and Black lives. I'm so honored to be a part of this panel, and thank you for including me.
Thank you for being part of it, sir. We appreciate it. And next, I'll turn it over to Tim Becker, who will moderate questions and answers. Tim, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you, Mayor Wheeler. And before we move forward with the questions, I also want to acknowledge the presence of a couple members of the community who did not speak, but who are here in support today. And those members of the community are State Representative Janelle Bynum and former Director of the Office of Violence Prevention, Antoinette Edwards. Thank you to both of you for standing alongside of us this afternoon. Now, members of the media, if you can use the raise hand icon, if you have a question, we would appreciate that so we know who you are. When I do call on you, please let us know who your question is for before asking. So I will be looking for those raised hands for anybody that has any questions. I see a couple right now. Jonathan Levinson from OPB, go ahead. Who's your question for?
This question's for Mayor Wheeler. On New Year's Day, you had a press conference on the same topic. You said that you were going to convene a meeting with federal, state, and local law enforcement to, you said, develop clear plans to address anarchist violence. You also said you wanted to institute a type of restorative justice where people convicted of vandalizing property would have to meet with the owners of that property and perform community service to repair damages. Did either of those two things happen, and do you have an update on how that's going?
Neither of those things have happened at this point because there frankly isn't interest in the part of the legislature to bring those issues forward. Those would have to happen at the statutory level. I still remain interested in both. Look, we arrested somebody the other night for a fairly egregious act of criminal destruction, and it's my understanding he'd been arrested at least 2 times previously in like the prior 6 to 8 weeks. And so my viewpoint is if you are a repeat offender and you get arrested, the second time you get arrested in close proximity and the third time you get arrested in close proximity to the second, it seems to me that the charge should increase. So that continues to be my perspective. I will continue to work with my other jurisdictional partners, including the district attorney and my colleagues in the state legislature and our judges in the court system. And hopefully there will be an acknowledgement that by the second or the third time you commit the same crime, it's not the same as the first time you did it. That's my personal value. So I obviously don't control all aspects of the criminal justice system. I am the police commissioner, so I control that piece of it, but I have to work with my colleagues who have responsibility over other parts of the criminal justice system in order to get their agreement.
You have another question, Jonathan?
Yeah, I did have one more.
One more.
Apologies to my colleagues. This is for Deputy Chief Davis. There are videos from Friday night of media being forced out of the area, the Kettle area, and other reporters said that they were forced to stay, a block away where they couldn't even see what was going on. Can you explain why that doesn't violate court orders against dispersing media?
Well, I would have to be a little more familiar with the specifics, and obviously those are questions, they're complicated legal questions that are subject to opinions on either side. And, one way in which we would be able to do something like that without violating the TRO, for example, might be if we allowed media to stay in the area. And my understanding was that they were removed from inside that area, which actually I would submit, it turns out was probably a good decision given the number of weapons and what that tells us about how safe it was to be in that area. But those are all questions that I'm sure we will have discussion about and answer as we review this event.
And if I could just jump in, Deputy Chief, we do have Robert Taylor, who is our senior attorney, available on this call for legal questions.
All right, let's move on. Let's go to Liz Birch, Coin TV. Liz, who's your question for?
Hi, I have two. The first one is for the mayor. I'm just wondering if there's any plans to do anything differently to prevent this vandalism in the future, since what happened over the weekend and Friday is pretty reminiscent of the 100 days of demonstrations we saw over the summer. And then my second question is for Deputy Chief. There's been a public outcry specifically from groups like the ACLU against the kettling tactics. I'm wondering if this is something that Portland Police will continue to do and how you make the determination when you make those mass detentions.
And I'm sorry, was just the first question for me or both of those questions for me?
That first one was for you.
Very good. So how are we going to prevent this in the future? It's very hard to prevent people who are intent on criminal destruction. Of course, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution guarantees the right to assembly. It guarantees the right to free speech. And therefore, the tactics that are being used by the Portland Police Bureau and our law enforcement partners are all after the fact. We have to balance the right to peacefully protest against the right to hold people accountable for actual criminal activity. And in the case of Friday night, there was considerable planning that was done in advance. There was scenario planning. There was an effort to make sure that we had adequate resources on the ground, knowing that it was the same group largely that had engaged in criminal destruction just a week or so prior. And then everything, of course, has to be done legally. And one thing that was not mentioned is when the incident commander makes a decision about specific tactics, that is done with legal counsel. And in this case, it was a district attorney sitting in the room, making sure that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. In terms of prevention, though, the reason we're here together today is to let people know who might be on the margin, trying to decide whether or not it's a good idea to engage in these activities, to hear directly, not only from law enforcement, that we will work to hold you accountable, but to also hear from members of the community who are often held up as the beneficiaries of these activities, telling people you're not helping them, you are in fact hurting them. And so I'm hopeful that getting our message out like this in a unified way is part of the process of preemptively ending some of this criminal activity and destruction before it happens. We really want these folks to think long and hard about what they are doing. They are not only, as you just heard today from some African-American leaders, detracting from and working against the values of BLM, they're also standing on the air hose of the economic recovery for a lot of our small businesses in this community.
You had a follow-up question, Liz?
I was hoping to hear from Deputy Chief Chris Davis about that second question on kettling.
Sure, and we're certainly aware of differing legal opinions from differing advocacy groups about the tactic of mass detention. And without going into granular detail of all of the considerations that go into a decision like that, in sum, if the focus of the group is really criminal activity, then you reach a point where there is effectively reasonable suspicion to stop the entire group. That's not a situation that we see very often. This is not a tactic that we use very often, but in this case, we believed that it was appropriate given all of the indicators that we had. The presence of some of the same folks that have been involved in damaging events in the past and events where criminal activity happened. And then just the way this group immediately acted in a similar way to groups where we've seen that before. They move as a cohesive group. They cluster around areas where crimes like vandalism are occurring. Most, if not all of them, are in the street, effectively blocking it for other people's use. And so the key for us is that in all the tactics we employ in public order situations, we are never reacting to the content of someone's speech. We are only reacting to their actions. And if there is criminal activity happening, people involved in that activity, whether it's a few people or it's the whole group, should be able to reasonably expect that there may be some lawful enforcement action that takes place.
All right, thank you, Deputy Chief Davis. And Liz, let's move along the list here. Maxine Bernstein, the Oregonian. Max, what's your question?
Thank you. I had a question for the City Attorney, Robert Taylor. And if you can describe, I know the city has had a number of favorable decisions from the courts regarding kettling, but can you describe what went into the legal analysis or justification before basically giving the green light to police to resume kettling? And can we expect to see more of this police maneuver?
Thanks, Maxine, for the question. Obviously, I won't comment on legal advice that we have given. It is true that there were two court decisions recently on the issue of mass detention, one in the Haber case and then one in the Ibarra case. Haber was decided on qualified immunity. The Ibarra case was determined that there was no Fourth Amendment violation where there is a group acting in a coordinated manner engaged in criminal conduct. And in that instance, if there's reasonable suspicion that the group is engaged in coordinated criminal conduct, then the group can be detained for purposes of a criminal investigation. The City of Portland Police followed the law as announced in that decision on Friday. And as far as whether this tactic will be used in the future or not, I would defer to the professionals at the police department. I would note, however, that On Friday, when this tactic was employed, it was peacefully used to stop the criminal conduct, and it also prevented further criminal conduct that evening. And that was done without the use of widespread tear gas or use of impact munitions, which has also been criticized by the community and others. And so this was an effort to obey the law and follow these recent court decisions, and also bring this criminal conduct to a peaceful end without using other alternatives.
Does that answer your question, Max?
Yes, I just had also a broader question for the mayor, and you know, we've heard similar messages by city leaders and law enforcement and community leaders over the last year, urging an end to violence on the streets, but yet it's continued. What do you hope makes this different, or what do you think will have an impact?
Yeah, first of all, let me just clarify. No tear gas was used on Friday, just to be clear on that point. So what's different, I think, is a couple of different things. Number one, the community is sick and tired of people engaging in acts of criminal destruction and violence and doing it under the guise of some noble cause. That's not what's happening here. And you heard significant evidence today that backs that. There were clearly bad actors amongst the group on Friday, and we're increasingly seeing that. So we have the community coming together and making that clear. We have law enforcement working together amongst different jurisdictions in a collaborative way that we have not been doing as effectively as possible previously. We're working closely with the district attorney to make sure that there are prosecutions of people who are engaged in egregious acts of criminal destruction and violence. And we saw the district attorney step forward with several dozen prominent convictions recently. We saw one case adjudicated where an individual who had broken a number of windows received 3 years of probation and $46,000 in restitution. So the word is getting out that people will be held accountable. We're changing our tactics. You saw that on Friday. And again, that was done with thoughtfulness, with planning, and making sure that the legal I's were dotted and the T's were crossed. So you should expect to see some different tactics being used going forward. And I'm hopeful not only on this issue of criminal destruction and violence, but also with regard to the gun violence situation, which frankly is our community's top public safety priority, is going to rely more heavily on interjurisdictional partnerships. And that includes working with our federal partners on investigative capacity, working closely, as we always do, with our Multnomah County Sheriff, working with the district attorney to make sure that if the Portland Police Bureau is making arrests, that they're also providing the adequate evidence that the district attorney needs to be able to make a successful conviction. All those pieces are coming into alignment now. And for me, that gives me confidence that we are on the path towards ending this nonsensical and valueless criminal destruction in the city of Portland.
All right, thank you, Max. Thank you, Mayor. Next up, Alex Zielinski. Who's your question for, Alex?
Hi, yeah. I believe this is probably for the mayor. I'm curious, the press release announcing today's press conference mentions that anarchists and white supremacists have been responsible for inflicting destruction. You've mentioned anarchist actions, but I'm curious if you or anyone with the police bureau or sheriff's department could give more details about recent white supremacist actions that you referenced.
Yeah, I'll defer to the Portland Police Bureau on any recent white supremacist actions. But look, we are in a time of political extremes. Today, we're here talking about what happened on Friday, and that could be characterized as criminal destruction that was coming from the self-described anarchist left. But we also have to acknowledge that in the United States, the number one public safety threat, according to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, is white nationalism. And we certainly saw elements of that coming to bear during the insurrection at the United States Capitol. And we certainly have to keep up our vigilance here in the city of Portland. I would expect that given that we are largely seen as a progressive community, we will continue to not only have the type of activities that we saw on Friday night continue to some degree, but I would also expect we will continue to see those who are engaged in intimidation or violence against immigrants, refugees, and people of color to also continue here in the city of Portland because they know they'll get a reaction. We have to be vigilant regardless of the politics involved. There is no room for violence or criminal destruction. And I don't give a damn what your politics are, nor should anybody else. It's about the behavior. And what we're saying here today is we do not support violence. We do not support criminal destruction. While we're talking narrowly about the events on Friday, that applies to everybody, regardless of your politics.
Thank you, Mayor. There, I was on mute myself. We just have time for a few more reporters here. How about Wright Yazaway from K2? Right?
Yeah, I just want to clarify something the mayor said earlier. You said the district attorney was in there, the district attorney's office in regards to that kettling, but they said they do not provide any legal advice. Did you mean the city attorney?
You know what? I'll defer to the Portland Police. I had heard it was actually a DA, but I could be mistaken. I'll refer that to the Police Bureau. I know that there is legal advice given. I don't know who was there because I wasn't there.
Yeah, we did, as I understand, we did have a representative of the DA's office in consultation with Incident Command, but they're not giving us legal advice as far as the city's liability or anything like that. What they're there to do is to help coordinate on prosecutions, give us some perspective on evidence that would be helpful to make sure we gather in any procedural issues that might get in the way of a prosecution that from an arrest related to one of these events. And we routinely work with the DA's office, but they are not our lawyers. They are the prosecutors for Multnomah County.
Okay, got it. And one more question for the mayor, more broadly speaking. The behavior this past weekend is not much different than what we've seen over the last several months. So I'm just curious, what was the final straw that led to this kind of police response?
Well, I've been all out of straws for a long time. I've been saying for months that we will not accept this kind of behavior. And now it's about having the tactics and the resources on the ground to prevent it. And there's been some wins, there's been some losses, and there's been some draws. But I think on Friday night, everything came together in a thoughtful way. There was adequate planning and preparation. There were adequate resources, and the tactics that were used were successful for the occasion in terms of peacefully stopping criminal destruction. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from this. That's not to say every one of these actions will go as well as Friday's did, but I believe the Portland Police Bureau and our law enforcement partners are evolving entities, and I think they are evolving as the tactics of the self-described anarchists evolve. And that's what I would expect them to continue to do. So there was no one thing that changed our tactics. I'm just hearing loudly and clearly from the community, as I have for months, that they're sick and tired of this criminal destruction. And the community at large has already figured out that this has nothing to do with BLM or any other noble causes. This is just about people getting together to break stuff because they think they can get away with it. And what we saw on Friday night is they're not going to get away with it.
Thank you. Thank you, Wright. Dan Haggerty, KGW. Dan, who's your question for?
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask a question to the Deputy Chief Davis. You said earlier that this was on Friday, the same group that we have seen time and time again for 9 months. I was just wondering how you know it was the same group and what you're using to kind of catalog who these people are and the differences between the various groups that we see. How do you know it's the same group and not a similar group?
I appreciate you asking that. There are a lot of indicators that it's the same basic group that's responsible for all of this. One is similarities in the way these events are promoted, and without giving up too many of our means of gathering forecasting information for these events. Similar language in terms of instructions for people coming to the event, and then similar behavior by the group. And then we have made a number of arrests at these events where officers now sometimes recognize some of the people in the groups. And of course, no one can say that it was all the same people every single time, but it's very similar behavior. Some of the same people, the same ways of describing the events in their advertisements, similar criminal activity in terms of vandalism and other things like that.
I was curious because these anarchist groups are often classified as leaderless groups. Do you feel that this is a leaderless group, or do you believe that there's kind of a defined hierarchy within the group you're describing now?
They are different than what we would expect, and you know, it's an interesting sociological phenomenon. These groups are, I would say, they're more organized than they're really led. They tend to resist having any one person identified as the leader and as an authority. They're almost crowdsourced, and so they'll come together and collaborate on their activities. And you know, that's like what we mean when we say that they act as a cohesive group. It's different than what people traditionally think of in terms of group behavior with one authority who dictates all of the moves, but they are still coordinated with one another.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dan. Let's go to Sarah Klein, Associated Press. Sarah.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I actually had a similar question. Mayor, I know in the past you've described this group as mostly young white males. Can you tell us any more about them? How many people you suspect are part of this group? And then also, have you attempted to try and sit down with any of them, or is that just not even going to happen?
Look, I have offered, well, first of all, I'll defer to the police who make the arrests, and they're the folks on the ground. My personal observation is that the groups are largely white, largely male, and largely young. That's not to say exclusively, but a couple of weeks ago when this group was going through the Pearl District, I actually was in close proximity and I had the opportunity to observe it myself. And I was surprised that they were very young. And yes, they were overwhelmingly white and they appeared to be overwhelmingly male. And based on the arrests that I've seen in the past as well, that would seem to be the case, but I'll defer to the police on that matter. And I forgot what the second part of the question was. Sorry, not enough capital.
No, it's okay. Have you had the opportunity or have tried to sit down with anyone from the group too?
Yeah, absolutely, and they won't. You know, I have on many occasions offered to sit down. They work anonymously. I get attacked by them on a regular basis, but it's usually anonymously. And I've said, look, take off the mask. Let's sit socially distanced away from each other. And I want you to explain to me how rampaging down Martin Luther King Boulevard, which was done previously, how that supports Black people in the city of Portland, or alternatively, when you came to my apartment building and you ransacked a business, why was the only business you ransacked owned by a Middle Eastern immigrant and the white businesses didn't seem to be touched? except he also burned the picnic tables from the Vietnamese family's restaurant across the street. Explain to me how that lifts people of color in our community. And as of yet, I haven't had any takers. Periodically, at the very beginning of this, I was invited to meet with a couple of roundtables of individuals. I even went out at the request of some folks who were engaged in the demonstrations to go out and meet with them. They basically shoved a megaphone in my face and swore at me for 20 minutes. So honestly, those conversations haven't been particularly productive. And if they have a set of philosophies, the public at large is utterly at a loss as to what that philosophy is. And as I say, I don't think there is one. When you come to a quote protest and you bring your gun or you bring your slingshot or you bring your axe or your hammer, that doesn't tell me you're there for peaceful purposes. That tells me that you are there as a bad actor for the purposes of conducting criminal acts. And as I've said on many, many occasions, I do not support violence or criminal destruction as a means to any political ends, regardless of what you state your philosophy as being.
All right, thank you, Mayor. We got time for one more, and that one is Tess Risky with Willamette Week. Tess?
Hey, I'll make it quick. Thank you. My question is for Mayor Wheeler. I just want to clarify your stance on kettling. Is this a tactic that you support the Portland Police Bureau using going forward?
So as you'll recall, the first time I encountered kettling as a tactic as mayor was, gosh, that was probably 3 years ago now, at least. It may have even been 4 years ago. And at the time I raised some questions, and I'm on the record as saying at the time, if this is a tactic that the Portland Police Bureau is going to use, I have some questions. And one of the questions was, is it legal? And you'll recall that we were sued by an array of civil rights groups. The second question was, has this been thoughtfully planned and carried out to full effect? And so what's different, fast forward to last Friday night, is there was planning that went into it. There was thoughtfulness that went into it. And the police bureau used that tactic. In fact, the incident commander directed that tactic, knowing that in fact, under limited circumstances with reasonable suspicion of criminal behavior, that it could be used legally. And my observation is that that tactic was used successfully, it was used peacefully, and it ended what could have been further criminal destruction in the city of Portland. So in that particular case, I applaud the Portland Police Bureau for their thoughtfulness, for their planning, and their attention to detail to make sure that legally the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed.
So I just want to clarify, is it fair to say that in some circumstances you support kettling as a tactic?
Absolutely, yes. In the case of Friday night, I think it was used appropriately as a law enforcement tactic. But I want to be clear, I don't direct it. That is a decision that is made by the incident commander. And if it's made by the incident commander, it's my expectation as the police commissioner and the mayor that it will be done so legally.
Thank you, Sarah. And folks, that will wrap it up for today. We'd like to thank all the speakers who joined us and those who've joined us just on our behalf that didn't speak, and to the reporters as well for being here. If you have any other questions that we haven't been able to get to, feel free to reach out to myself or Jim Middaugh in the mayor's office, and we'll get back to you with some responses. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody.